Now we're going to move on to our panel discussion. Our first session is called A Perfect Storm: Expansion, Stagnation, and Disruption. The moderator for this panel is going to be Andrew McAfee. He's the co-director of MIT's Initiative of the Digital Economy and a principal research scientist at the MIT Sloan School of Management. Andrew. The panelists I would like to welcome to the stage are Darren Acemoglu, who is the professor of economics, again here at MIT, Diana Farrow, who's the president and CEO of JP Morgan Chase Institute, and Tina George, who is the global lead delivery systems.
The partnership between CSAIL and IDE remains healthy.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does.
Even in the wake of that horrific accident.
Sorry, Tina George is the global lead of delivery systems, social protection, and jobs global practice at World Bank. Thank you.
All right, while I maneuver myself out of the way, Jerome, let's start with you. Are the robots, in fact, taking all the jobs?
No, but I think there's a lot to be worried about. So actually what we hear a lot about is two very different narratives about what's going on. One is that we are in the midst of the most striking, amazing technologies that's going to increase our wealth, and we're all going to be so well off. And then the other one is that robots are coming, and that's just terrible, and jobs are going to disappear. We're going to see the end of work. Actually, reality looks a little bit different from both of them, but there is a lot to be worried about. So if I can show you two slides, or three slides, actually. So this one, not this one. I can see it here, but yeah. This one is from the work by Bob Gordon. It looks at how productivity in the US economy has improved over time. And the rate of improvement, as you can see from 1980s onwards, is actually pretty disappointing relative to what we had in the previous decades. So if you turn to the next slide, actually what you'll see is that the situation is actually worse for the labor market. So one way of thinking about the labor market is how much are employers willing to pay? So that's the overall wage bill. And you see its growth rate. It's growing about 2%, 2.5% a year in the 4 decades right after World War II. And from 1990s onwards, it's essentially stagnant. It's growing about 1% a year, and then it's becoming completely flat. And really, the weight of this is falling on the shoulders of middle skill and low skill workers. So the last slide I'm going to show you is the next one, which looks at what's happening to the real wages discounted by the CPI of different education groups. And what you can see is that the top guys, the gray ones, are doing well. Those are the postgraduates, people with MBAs or PhDs or advanced degrees. But everybody else is doing pretty badly. So the yellow triangles, those are college graduates. Not much of a wage growth for college graduates. And if you look at high school graduates, if you're a high school graduate man at the moment, and your father was a high school graduate man, you're earning about 35% less in real terms. So whatever we're doing, we're not actually generating inclusive growth, shared growth. So I think this is not, the problem isn't that robots are taking the jobs and that's the end of the story. And it's not that we're running out of ideas. I think the story is that we're not using a lot of new ideas, a lot of new creativity that's coming out from every corner of the economy. We're not using it the right way. And in particular, we are not getting enough productivity growth from these new technologies, and more importantly, perhaps, we're also not gearing these technologies for creating jobs. So if you think of what is the most important preoccupation of many very creative people in the economy right now, it's automate, 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 find ways of using AI in order to do things that humans were capable of doing before. That's great as a challenge, but it's not necessarily the best way of using that technology. So if we can find a way of mobilizing technology and mobilizing our talent so that we try to increase productivity, but at the same time create jobs for people, and in particular that will typically involve, and it has always involved, going back to the British Industrial Revolution, the beginning of the 20th century in the US, finding new tasks, new industries, new occupations where people are going to be able to work with technology to do things that are quite productive and big, important contributions for the economy. I think we're not doing enough of that, and that's why we're seeing these real wage declines.
And I want to come back to that point and talk about what we could and should be doing differently. But are these optimists, these techno-optimists like me and Eric, are we just wrong? Answer this question super carefully.
I could never claim you guys are wrong. No, you're
But
right.
The productivity growth
You're
numbers
right.
say that
You're
we're
right
wrong.
that, so it depends on which point of view you look at it. If you look at it from the point of view, what's going on to our creativity? What's going on to our ability to invent things? What's going on to the amount of resources and the capability that we have for turning those resources into new ideas? You are right. But if you are...
Thank you, we're just about out of time.
And but you are wrong, I was going to say. If you are looking at it from the point of view of, are we able to get enough more stuff, goodies for the people, and especially for the majority of the people in the American economy or in the European economy for that matter, you're not right. And the reason why you're not right, I think there's a bottleneck and there are some barriers in front of turning that creativity, those new ideas into things that are going to improve our welfare. And those barriers are not government created. They're mostly business created. They're about the way that we think about it, about the ecosystem, about how we organize the world.
Great. Diana, from the cockpit that you and your colleagues have at the JP Morgan Chase Institute, you got this wonderful view of what's actually happening in the economy. Is what you see largely consistent with what Drone just showed us?
It is, and I would, I'd like to offer a couple of few things. These kind of macro figures kind of mask the reality of what's happening on the ground. And we have our own data that suggests this, but since we're at MIT, I want to bring that to life from data from the MIT Living Wage Lab, which some of you may know about. I think it's phenomenal work. And what they've done, in effect, is they've found the median city in the US, St. Cloud, Minnesota.
Is that right?
So they say, and they document at a very micro level the kind of work that we do, transaction by transaction, household by household. What does it take to have a living wage in this median town in America? To buy groceries, to have a normal house, to not to save for retirement or for college, just for a living wage. And the answer that they conclude for a couple that works is $16 an hour. That's what it takes to maintain a life in a median city in America. 42% of Americans make less than $15 an hour. Okay, so that is the reality of what you're trying to describe. Often when people get worried about these developments, they're thinking technologies are going to take the jobs away. I don't think we need to worry about jobs at all. We have a record unemployment rate right now in the US. People are working often more than one job, multiple jobs. That is not the issue. The issue is the economy creating. Thank you.
I get the point. Thank you.
I was saying, I don't think we have a jobs issue. We have record unemployment rate in the United States right now. Not true in all other developed countries, but let's just take the US for a minute. What we don't have is an economy that's generating a path of job growth for people where they can maybe start at low wages, but build up to a level of prosperity that allows them to save for retirement, to save for their kids' college, to take a vacation once in a while. That is what we need to worry about. And I do think that there are elements about what's happening today with the rate of technology and the sheer law of big numbers in the way that we are now incorporating technology into our economy that is going to belie things that we economists have been saying forever. There's jobs destruction, there's new jobs that come, don't worry, that's just the whole process of creative destruction. I think the work that folks have done at the OECD that really demonstrates that path of replacement is really slowing down. Why? Because disruption is happening much, much faster than new creation. So just to put fine tone on it, in their work, they document that in the 90s, if you looked at what of these industries, all this technology was creating new higher value added jobs that people were moving into. About 8.82 or 8.4% of jobs were these higher value added jobs that people were migrating to as jobs are being destroyed through technology. If you look at the 90s, that was 4.4%. So you had a deceleration of that kind of creation vis-a-vis much greater destruction. And if you look at the 2000s, 0.5%.
Wow.
Okay, so this story that we've been telling ourselves, and I would have been telling 15 years ago, look, it's a wonderful process of innovation and creative destruction. The destruction is happening faster than the rate of new creation, at least as it relates to high value add jobs that provide this career path for folks. And I do think we need to worry about it. I think the other narrative that we forget, because the most obvious disruption that sits in the history books today was the movement from agriculture to manufacturing, and people use that to say, hey, look, it all worked out fine. If you go back, go read Steinbeck, go read places, these were periods of massive social upheaval and massive difficulty for large numbers of people, and left alone, the market will not necessarily yield the right results. You know, you and Eric talk a lot about, there's no law that says these things have to be distributed properly. What happened, at least in the US and certainly in many OECD countries, was social movements around, you know, universal education, K-12 education, social movements around transitions and safety nets, and we kid ourselves to think that the market is going to, on its own, allow these technologies to infiltrate and then yield the kinds of outcomes in a society that we want. And I think that's the lesson of history.
Can you help us understand a really basic puzzle? You mentioned that we have record low unemployment. And my Econ 101 textbook said, look, the one sure cure for lousy wage growth is very low unemployment.
Yeah.
Here we are with very low unemployment. We still have lousy wage growth.
So this is the other paradox that speaks directly to this. One of the things that concerns me the most when I look at the macro figures of the economy, this is true for the US and for the OECD in general, is if you look at the total share of income that is going to labor.
Great.
So no matter how many people are working, whatever, just zoom out and say, what's the total share of income that is going to labor versus, of course, capital, shareholders? The total share of labor at the end of the World War in the US was 66% of total income was going to labor. The last time this was measured, in 2016, 58% was going. So the portion of the extraordinary job creation that's happening is being apportioned to any number of workers. You can have all of them that you want, but they're not participating to the extent that they used to in the total income growth.
And we want to dive in a little bit on why that might be and what we might do about it if we were concerned. But I want to broaden out a bunch because both of you two have talked primarily about America and about rich countries in the OECD. Tina, you focus on the rest of the world where most of the human beings actually live. And one of the things I've learned from you is that we're used to, in the rich world, we're used to people kind of having a job with an employer. And you've helped me understand that's actually really the exception instead of the rule as we look in developing countries.
Absolutely, and I have a few slides to show you as well. Actually, let me just, so.
Look, as long as I don't get hit by that thing anymore, I don't care what you do.
Let me just go back here for
Do we have your slides?
Okay, so we think, okay, oh, well.
I think it'll
I
show
guess
up
it's
pretty
not-
quickly.
It'll show up. It'll
Good.
show up. But we think that the declining labor shares and income and the job polarization are really only symptoms. And you know, I think Professor Brynjolfsson's talked about this today, that if we think about the technologies, they complement and augment some skills while they replace others. And education and skills really determine whether that promise is going to be realized or whether a lot of people are going to be left behind. And what we see in the developing world is that there's very poor digital literacy even. So if you think about 3/4 of third graders in Mali and Uganda, they cannot read. And in Africa, 7 in 10 people do not use the internet, and 4% do not know what the internet is. And when we talk about informality, Absolutely, as you've rightly pointed out, persistent informality is the norm. The developed world is really grappling with this issue right now, but this is what emerging economies have been grappling with for a while. So 90% informality in India, which has advances in nuclear technology and in space technology, 50% in Latin America, 60% in South Asia, 70% in sub-Saharan Africa, where I focus on. And so when we think about these sorts of issues, we're talking of how should we be supporting people in remote and isolated areas, because they are most likely to fall even further behind. So when we talk about AI and machine learning and the impact of these technologies, we're talking of the bottom 40% of the people, and the people who are less educated are the ones who are most likely to be left behind as more things move from the real world to the virtual world. And secondly, how can we look at this as an opportunity to look at the gender gaps in labor force participation? On the one hand, we talk about getting more women into STEM, but if we think about this, there's a gender sorting that's happening across occupations as well. So women sort themselves into occupations that are more likely to be automated away. So there's a greater impact on women as well. Even though, on the other hand, if you think about it, these sorts of Uberized marketplaces can help women in terms of the flexible economy and in flexible work and the care economy, et cetera. And thirdly, this is an issue very close to my heart, is exactly as Deanna was pointing to, how can we build social protection systems that allow us to shift gears to support people in developing countries? Is it possible for governments to support open license, open source, open standards type portable platforms that allow people to take benefits to go? So you don't have that de jure relationship between the employer and the employee, the whole Bismarckian construct, but we think about how individuals can have benefits that are supported through tiny micro contributions through some sort of behavioral nudges, but that can be topped up by government. So this is what we're really focusing on operationally in sub-Saharan Africa, for instance.
And are we seeing any green shoots on exactly that area? Us digital optimists get so excited about the potential to improve the lives and the financial stability of people at the base of the pyramid. Is it happening yet?
Yes, absolutely. And I love that question, because one of the projects—
I was proud of it, thank you.
So one of the projects that we are very heavily engaged in right now is a project to bring unique identification numbers to West Africa, to the ECOWAS region. So we have 5 countries in the mix right now, and our aim is to bring 100 million unique IDs to West Africans by 2028, and this will be on the model of India's Aadhaar, which went out to 1.2 billion people.
And would you call that Indian initiative a success yet? Is it too early to tell? How is it changing the country?
Well, to the extent that the Indian ID initiative has really paved the way for us to look at how do you link unique identification numbers for people to service delivery. So how do you deliver services? Because that was actually my next slide. That is, we are talking about building Star Wars technology, but we're really living in Flintstones era delivery systems in many of these countries. There's a huge gap between what we're talking about and where people are in the rest of the world. So even getting something as basic as India's unique identifier out to people in sub-Saharan Africa, where 500 million people have no way of proving who they say they are, that in itself will be a huge gain for service delivery in our view.
So far, I would classify this panel as, I think the technical term is a bummer. Do any of you want to give us good news about this period that we're living through, or about, you know?
Maybe I will.
That was an
and
uncomfortably long pause.
I'll tee up to something that you were finishing off with, Darun, which I think is right, is the technologies in themselves are really neutral. And the question is, how do we organize ourselves in society to address the things that we think are most important to be addressed. And I think we have relied in many good ways, in ways that I would support and think we should continue to rely on some version of profit seeking and sort of rent maximizing approaches to drive that. I wonder if in the scheme of the scale and scope of the changes we have, that kind of micro let each agent decide is the only way, if there are complementary ways of driving that, because every one of these technologies, particularly the AI, the digitization that allows a whole set of things to be machine readable and therefore reimagined, the material science that is enabling us as humans to live longer, healthier, et cetera, enhanced in many, many ways, can be addressed to solve the kinds of problems that we have, whether it's climate change or water pollution. And so I think the not so bummer side of this is the notion that we might organize ourselves in ways, as we have done in the past, to deal with other challenges and harness these technologies to address what are, in fact, incredibly large problems of the world that can be addressed. So I don't think it's all negative, but I think my major point would be that it's not going to happen on its own. And I think we're a little bit, paying attention to the wrong things right now, would be my guess. So I get back to the bummer, I'm sorry.
So I
agree. Yeah. Thanks for that uplifting contribution. Yeah.
I agree with that, but let me try to put a little bit more flesh on the bones of what the problem is. So actually, it's good you brought up the issue of the mechanization of agriculture, Diana. That is a very fascinating episode, and one is people really discount, as you say, the Steinbeck moment, that it was a really painful episode, but also the description of how things worked out needs to be understood a little bit, needs to be fleshed out also. The way, mechanization of agriculture was associated with a huge loss of jobs in agriculture. The share of labor in agriculture declined, just like telltale sign of automation. But at the same time, industry jobs started expanding. And there are two things that are really important there, which really contrast with what's going on today and give us a way forward. One is that already agriculture was low wage, industry was high wage. Industry was high labor share in value added, agriculture was low labor share in value added. So really that reallocation really helped labor demand.
So the natural transition was good for the average worker.
But even more importantly, during that period, there are two things that are really remarkable. One is that industry completely changed what it did. Where do a lot of the people who got high school, where did they go? They actually, some of them became teachers and things like that, but many of them became white-collar workers in industry. So the white-collar industry jobs completely exploded during that sector. And many new industries added a whole variety of new things to do onto their menu. And as a result, what you see actually is not just that industry is expanding, it's labor share is increasing and wages are increasing in industry. Contrast that to what's going on today. Manufacturing is the sector where you see the automation. So which is the sector in which the labor share is declining? It's almost completely manufacturing. Yeah. But that is the high wage sector, and we're actually not seeing any new types of jobs being created in services to any meaningful extent, and we're not seeing the labor demand pick up, new things being done, labor share or wages pick up in industry, in services. So people are not as unemployed as they were perhaps 10 years ago, but the reason for that is they're being pushed into low wage jobs. So that is not the way to replicate, if there was a success, the success of the mechanization of agriculture. And I think I completely agree with Diana. Even the mechanization of agriculture could have been done much better if somebody was helping with the market mechanisms to facilitate with social insurance, with education that got more support, help for people to know where to go. People were just out in the wild. They had no idea. Their livelihood completely disappeared. Perhaps we're a little bit better informed about that, but not that much better. So really, the natural progression is that we should find ways of making services much more productive, much higher wage, much better technologies to complement labor in services, but we're not doing any of that. And if anybody in the technology hubs of this country or the world is actually thinking about services, they're thinking, how can we automate more of the services? How can we get rid of those low-wage workers doing customer service? Or how can we get rid of the teachers and nurses? No, we need more teachers and more nurses, but more meaningful, more technology-powered ways with high productivity for the nurses, technicians, and the teachers to do. That, I think, is the change in perspective that I think might be revolutionary if we undertake it.
Tina, I'm going to try one more time. For some, I'm
For
dogged
some good
optimist
news?
about this.
I thought I was saying good news.
But I want to, so that's why I'm coming to you, because
Because we failed.
this is, yeah, you guys, thanks. This is my Hail Mary effort. Is it not true that we have seen sharper declines in dire poverty around the world?
Yes.
Faster, quicker in the past generation than ever before in human history?
Yes, we have. But the
Should we
income-
not cheerlead for that a little bit?
We should, absolutely, absolutely. But we are in danger of widening income inequality. So to me, the real risk is the widening income inequality. And for that bottom of the pyramid, that's something we should be concerned about and something that we should work towards putting forward solutions. And as Daron was saying, there is a role here for governments and especially in developing countries to think about how do we offer social insurance, social protection as a whole for people who are in that informal economy and for the people who are going to be hurting as a result of this, the changes that are happening halfway around the world for them. So there is really something to be had there. So to me, that's the silver lining. Maybe what we experiment and think through on the developing side of the world might eventually end up helping pave the way for the gig economy workers in the more developed world that, and they're looking for these solutions as well.
You mentioned the word that's on everybody's lips these days, which is inequality. And I want to double down on that because it strikes me that maybe that's not exactly the problem. And I don't have slides, so I'm going to draw graphs with my fingers. I can imagine two different scenarios. One is where the top earners are going like this for a lot of the reasons that we've talked about, but the people in the middle and the people at the bottom
are all going down.
Well, that's scenario number two. Don't work ahead of my fingers, please. But people at the bottom are also gaining wages, getting more prosperous over time, just at a slower rate than the 1%ers. In that world, inequality is going up. Mm-hmm. Is that something we should be concerned about, or would that not be a good thing?
Well, okay, maybe.
Because what I'm trying to understand is if the gap is the real problem here, the growing gap, or the fact that these folk are actually trending downward over time, as Daron showed us earlier.
So I actually do have a slide on that. Let me try and see how I can go back. No?
Go back.
Back?
No, that's not helping.
No?
Can we get that to fall on me again while we're waiting for the slides to come back up? Oh, Tina, while you're finding that, I want to tee up another question for everyone here. If I handed you a magic wand of policy and said, great, you get to make, let's call it one or two changes. Diana and Daron, I'll ask you about America and the rich world. Tina, you can talk about the developing world. You get the magic wand of policy. It's got like 2 spells in it, maximum. What would you do with that magic wand?
I think it's really difficult to think of just 2 big things because it's a combination of many, but let me give 2 of the many, completely emphasizing that those are not magic bullets. So I think actually in the US, the 2 that I would like to share with you is 1, our tax system massively favors capital. So we are at a period where we are having a hard time generating jobs and generating enough labor share. And we're really taxing labor and we're favoring capital, and it's actually gotten worse. But it was pretty bad under the several administrations before the current one too. We tax labor, we put lots of employer contributions on it, we subsidize capital through interest rate deductions, amortization, lots of other ways. And that pushes people to use capital instead of labor at the margin, even when that's inefficient.
So a rational executive would look at buying the machine versus hiring another person and say, this is becoming increasingly a no-brainer.
Exactly.
Give me the machine.
Exactly.
Okay, got it.
And then the second one is that, you know, if you think about how the technology market worked for the 40 years or so when things were working out, you know, the private sector was the driver, but there was a very powerful agent pushing that driver. That was the government. So many of the important technologies that we have developed have the fingerprints of the government, both in terms of resources, but also actually influencing the direction of technological change.
Give us an example.
Well, Internet. Internet
GPS.
was completely government-led. Pharmaceuticals, nanotechnology, a lot of the advances in biotech, all of those are examples where the government set the agenda, and then, but it was not in a rigid way. It was not like the government, it wasn't like Soviet Russia, you're gonna do this, but there's a lot of demand for this. You know, here are the resources, why don't you go after this? And that has completely disappeared. Now, I think the government, partly because resources are not there, partly because, you know, places like Silicon Valley or just around us, that's where the high prestige, the whiz kids are. The government just cannot really compete with them in terms of prestige, status, you know, knowledge, but it's completely in the background. But what I was just suggesting a second ago is that that natural dynamic is not pouring enough resources into creating technologies that are going to contribute to wage growth and employment growth.
So this kind of heroic narrative that we hear, some libertarian narrative that we hear out of Silicon Valley, that we did this all ourselves and it's just, you know, individual brilliance, this is just wrong.
That's wrong and is part of the problem.
Great.
I
Jana,
agree.
So I would add to that list, because I agree with you, there's no silver bullet on this. It's not that kind of problem. And
it's not that we're missing the one stupid magic thing we should be doing.
no, but I think that the incentive structures around the highest order point that we all keep making is it doesn't matter how much the economy is growing if the share that's going to labor is decreasing.
Great.
And so structuring the incentives around an economy, whether it's the tax system or other mechanisms around making sure that we're getting whatever's happening to income, labor is participating in that, I think is one. The other one that we would be remiss not to put as one of the key components, although I sometimes think it gets oversold as the answer, is education. And one observation that you hear a lot in the private sector, I think it's skirting the issue sometimes, but it is also true, it is that there have never been more job openings that can't get filled today than we've ever had before. And so it's not that there aren't high value added jobs, but we have a big skills mismatch. And I don't think that the answer, of course, pre-K education is important. Of course, K through 12 reform is important. Of course, all the things that we talk about, but we can't wait 2 generations to fix that. There are many, many things we can do starting today that I think begin to change that equation. And I would say MIT is actually on the forefront of it. One of my favorite examples is this pilot that MIT set up with the MOOC for intro circuitry. And for those of you who know the story about MOOCs, tons and tons of people sign up and tons of people drop out. But you know, it's typically a 5% completion rate. At 5% completion rates, when you get this intro circuitry course up and running around the world, 150,000 people sign up. Some 7,000 people make it through the system. Finally, completion, full certification, MIT circuitry class. That's more students making it through that class than MIT will ever get in 40 years. Okay, so that beginning to much more aggressively think about not just who has access to a computer, who can go and get trained, but how we take advantage of all these technologies to modularize the skills that allow people to participate today, not through waiting a whole generation of education reform. I think that's going to be another really important part of the system. And I don't think that this you know, college for all, as we think about college today, gets us from here to there. I think it's about remodularizing how we think about education and making it available on an ongoing basis and just-in-time kind of thing for what people need.
If I could just add one thing, because I completely agree, and that would have been one of the 3 or 4 if I would. But there's one thing else, something else about education that I think is really great. It's exactly that we could try to provide the skills for the workers to be, but also it's a sector that's really hungry for technology and creating the sort of jobs that are going to complement, that are going to be complemented by technology. So, what is the solution to the sorts of problems that Diana is outlining is to have more personalized education that is more modularized, that actually deals with the specific problems that specific students have. And so that means you need to have more teachers, you need to have teachers that are going to be able to track what the students are doing. So it's a great application of AI, completely changed the way that we actually conceptualize the classroom. That hasn't changed for 200 years. There's a teacher who lectures and people listen, whether they're having a hard time or they're finding it trivial. All of these could change, and that would mean something that's very difficult, more resources into education. That wouldn't make sense. Nobody would create those educational technologies if we say, no, we're not going to hire more teachers, and the teachers are going to be as unskilled as they are at the moment. So you really need to revolutionize everything at two fronts. More teachers and more skills for them so that they can work with AI. They can really think of these modularized, completely different way of providing a richer set of skills.
Tina, before we hear from you, I just want to remind you, we're going to open it up for questions for our panelists pretty quickly here. So please, if you could line up at microphones, if you have questions for any of us, that would be great. All right, you now have the magic wand.
Okay, do I get 5 wishes?
No,
I have a long list.
Give us your top 1 or 2.
Okay, so my top one would be finding the social protection delivery systems for people in the informal sector. And that will help us port over what that means for gig economy workers on the developed side as well. So that would be my top.
Do you think those portable benefit delivery mechanisms, are they much more likely to be digital in the world that we're heading into?
Absolutely,
okay.
Absolutely. And I see a role for mobile, I see a role for, so in Ghana, for instance, MTN has the small little mobile money solutions that allows people to save as they go, but tiny micro savings. And if governments could then come up and top that up, then it would start to go into the realm of figuring out social insurance. And so, and again, on the ID's perspective with Benin, we are looking at something called the ARCH program for informal sector workers. And in fact, I'll be going to Benin in a couple of weeks to look at how exactly can we link, if everybody has a number, how can we link that up to people making those micro savings to then allow people to have these portable benefits to go. To me, I think social protections for people as those incomes start really going down is really very important for us to think about. We have to be thinking about universal health coverage, social insurance. These are just, it's imperative that we think about it and that governments start to think about these issues.
And do you see an opportunity for the developing world to kind of leapfrog what we've done in the rich world with social protections in the same way that in sub-Saharan Africa, they ain't laying copper to get telephone networks out there?
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's what we've seen with India with Aadhaar.
Great, makes sense. Let's throw it open for questions, and if we could all keep in mind the 3 rules of a fantastic question are that it is clear, that it is short, and that it is a question. Show us the way, please.
Well, that's quite the pressure. I'm Nicola Morlika from Microsoft Research. I was wondering, you're talking a lot about the declining share of income to labor, and I've seen a bunch of commentary in the media and policies such as GDPR that is trying to give people more of the income share of their data, which is driving the machine learning algorithms that we see transforming the economy. And I was wondering if you think that that will close the gap or help close the gap, or if it's just like, chaff.
So I think that's a great question. And I do think that one of the most interesting distinctions between the value that was created by old companies and the value that's being created by new companies is that old companies had, cost of goods sold stuff and labor cost stuff that was kind of internal to the company. So if you think about McDonald's serves, 60 million people or something, and they had 400,000 employees peak or something of that sort. And then you think about a new economy type of company that's serving 500 million users, and is only got 5,000 employees. How does that work? Because so much of the value that's being created is the users themselves contributing data and information and all that where in fact the companies are having the people do the work for themselves. Every time you click on like at Netflix or you click on something, you're creating value for the company. I do think that, I don't know if GDPR as it is, this is the data privacy kind of rules that are making their way in Europe and now in California, I think will make their way through the US eventually. I don't know that they are actually addressing that issue in the right way. I think that they're too narrowly cast to the view of protect me from Big Brother or protect me from somebody, as opposed to protect the fact that this is value that should accrue to me. And I think there is real promise in that question back to incentives to allow labor to participate more in the total income share.
It's really a beautiful question because it goes back to the question of should we be more user-centric or should we be government-centric or should we be, so who's that trusted intermediary? Is it the market, is it the government, is it the end user? So it's a question that we don't have answers to right now. From where I'm sitting, I would say the government has the trusted intermediary, but with a whole lot of user focus, but at the same time being able to have those sorts of protections in place to make sure that government is not a big brother, or at the market level that we don't have these winner-take-all sort of arrangements where they own all the data on you and then they monetize it. So it's a beautiful question, and it's really tricky as well. I don't think we know the answers to those.
Please.
Hello, I'm a K-8 educator, and I heard you talking a lot about education and how we could make it more modular and support teachers. What skills do you think we need to be, not just how do we change the education, but what goals of education do you want to see come forth to help us with this transition?
I think that's actually a fantastic question because the answer
Love
is very
that
simple.
question. Yeah.
We don't know. And we don't know because nobody has asked it. That's depressing. You know, this is why I sort of, the subtext of what I've been saying is we're really asleep at the wheel. So, a lot of things about the future really depend on whether the workers are going to have the skills that are going to be valuable in the new marketplace and whether it's going to facilitate the new technologies and going to be complemented by new technologies. And nobody has actually really done a systematic study. The government is not even asking these questions. It's not helping us collect data on what are those skills. Do you need more numeracy skills? Do we need more STEM? Do we need a mixture of STEM and communication skills? Do you need more soft skills? Do you need more teamwork? Do you need more flexibility? Completely different mindset? Or, if we knew the answers to that, then it would be much easier for the teachers, augmented with the technology and augmented more resources to deal with that, but we just don't know.
Have you seen anything suggestive?
I think what we have seen suggestive is that it's multifaceted. So it's really, you need the soft skills and the communication skills together with the numeracy. Not a single one of them is going to be enough, but that's just very suggestive based on a few surveys in which incidentally such data exist, and then you do some correlations, but far from causality or the sort of the gold standards that we would aspire to.
Tina?
Just a little bit of perspective. So this year I represented us at the G20 on digital economy. And it was really interesting watching some of the discussions because as international organizations, we're observers to the G20. And so we provide knowledge or advice from time to time. And one of the things that came out is we don't have a way to measure in a standard way across the board, across every single country, what digital skills are. If you think about it, the ITU has one way of going about it, and the OECD has another way of going about it. We have another way. You have the PISA scores, but still, we don't know how to measure this in a standard way across the board.
Deanna, did you want to dive in on this?
No, I see so many questions. We should hear the questions.
And unfortunately, we have time, given how thorough our answers are, we have time for one more. Sir, no pressure, but you're asking the final question.
Oh,
Thank you.
sorry.
So, and this is a great panel here. I think that this goes back a little bit to one of the points you were making earlier as the moderator here, but I think empirically speaking, we are at a place as a world where we are so much better off than we were during the last, during the Industrial Revolution, and even much more recently. If you look at the website ourworldindata.org, like essentially every major indicator is just going up and to the right. Child mortality has gone from like 20-25% globally in the 1950s down to about 5% today. Poverty is down, death rates from famine are down. So everything is getting empirically better for almost everybody, and the rising tide is everywhere. So the question I think is a really important one, which is if things are getting better for everyone as technology is advancing, broadly speaking, how do we address this question of inequality without hampering this massive rising tide effect, right? So it's so, I worry
We got it. We only have like a minute and a half left, and I want to give us time for some answers, because this is a wonderful question, yeah? Why are you all so bummed out, given that most of the things we care about are heading in the right direction?
I have to beg to disagree that everything is heading in the right direction, because in fact, I was just looking at the poverty numbers yesterday regionally, and if you look at Middle East, North Africa, Yemen and Djibouti are going up. So we see some of the images that are coming up from around the world. So I don't think that this is, that as a blanket it's coming down. Definitely it's improving in countries such as India and China, but we're still seeing a lot of inequality. And if you look at the inequality numbers, and you'll see that a lot of Southern African countries dominate in terms of the Gini coefficients.
Yeah, I would agree that the picture is more nuanced, and I think you can certainly find wonderful examples of where the world is improving for a lot of people. But I think that whether it's some of the figures you cited or one of the things that I look at a lot, life expectancy is actually dropping for large numbers of people in the developed world, particularly uneducated men, and healthcare outcomes have really diverged enormously between wealthy and less wealthy people. And so I think that the question you ask is the right one. How do we harness all the benefits of this stuff? And we see the benefits all over the place, not everywhere, but in many places, while bridging some of the fallout of that. And I don't like to be a bummer, but I would just underscore the thing that we keep saying is, it's wonderful that you all have convened this for us to talk about this, but if you look at what the social discourse is right now, what's in the headlines, what's in the newspaper, what people are reading every day, this is not the conversation that's occupying our policymakers, it's occupying our constituents, the people who voted and didn't vote, and this is what has to be center stage, is what is the kind of society we want to create, and how do we create the economic horsepower to generate that kind of society that benefits all of us. And so I think that's the only way we get the answer to your question.
Jeroen, last word, make it quick, please.
Okay, just very quickly. So, I agree with what's been said, but you're right. It's very important what has been achieved around the world, even if it's not completely uniform. But an important point is that as we are getting richer and used to more technologies and more new goods around us, our aspirations are increasing too. Look at Greece. The Greek crisis, led to a decline of about 20% in per capita incomes, and the whole society is devastated. It's really a complete demoralization, problems everywhere. But if you look at it from like the last 2 generations, income standards in Greece doubled. But that's not important because its aspirations were really high. So now everywhere around the world, aspirations are rightly high, but we're not really doing the right job in meeting those aspirations.
Great note to end on. Panelists, this has been fantastic. Thank you all very much.
Thank you
Thanks
for
all.
having us. Thank you all.